Night air crept through the quiet street, pressing against old brick and crooked iron fencing. In the faint glow of a distant street lamp, he noticed movement beyond the rusted gate. 5 figures stood among the leaning headstones, their shadows merging into the darkness. He slowed. One of them, a tall man in a heavy coat, held a slim device with an antenna. A second man aimed a handheld camera at the headstones, while a woman crouched by a grave and tapped the screen of her phone. They moved in slow, deliberate motions, pausing whenever the device hissed or clicked. The tall man lifted the instrument as though measuring the air. A hush settled on the group. The device crackled, and the woman looked over her shoulder. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Her voice carried an anxious thrill. The others pressed closer. The second man whispered something about electromagnetic pulses. The woman touched the ground as though expecting it to speak. They all wore expressions of cautious awe, fixated on each pop and warble from the machine. He watched from the sidewalk, hands buried in his coat pockets. A passing car swept its headlights over the gate, illuminating a row of headstones worn blank by centuries of wind and rain. He knew all about these devices. He'd read articles that explained how easy they were to fabricate. EMF meters, voice recorders altered to make strange sounds out of white noise, motion sensors set to scream at the slightest disturbance. People wanted to believe. Given the chance, they'd gather in churchyards with shaky cameras, waiting for a flicker of light or a static-laced pseudo-whisper. Anything that they could convince themselves felt like contact with the beyond. The tall man muttered, "Just here," pointing toward a cracked slab of stone. The device gave a faint beep, and the woman stood quickly, cradling her phone. Her eyes darted across the darkness. "Oh my God," she whispered, breath steaming in the cold. He exhaled, a short, silent laugh that stayed in his chest and left its own ghost in the cold night air. Then he stepped back from the gate, leaving the spook hunters to their illusions, and headed home. He lived in a cramped flat a few streets away. Narrow corridors led to rooms that smelled of old paint and stale coffee. Lights buzzed overhead with the faint hum of old wiring. His landlord forever reluctant to replace anything that still turned on. Usually he'd be lay on the sofa, idly scrolling through Facebook or watching Vines. But tonight he stood in the kitchen and thought of the graveyard. The group's intensity lingered in his mind. They leaned over that device as if it held absolute truth. They hung on every burst of static. It seemed so simple to replicate. He rummaged through boxes in the corner of the living room where he kept salvaged electronics, mismatched cables, circuit boards liberated from old appliances, a roll of LED strips he'd never used. He set them on the table, the overhead light casting a dull glow on battered plastic and bent wiring. Piece by piece, he arranged what he needed: a small microphone, a speaker no larger than his palm, a spool of thin copper wire for the coil, and an assortment of resistors and capacitors. The idea was straightforward. Feed the microphone's signal into the speaker, allow it to loop and distort, then let external electromagnetic fields interfere. A cheap LED could flicker whenever the loop registered a spike. He bent over the table and began to solder, a faint smell of resin drifting up as the iron touched metal. The hiss of hot flux reminded him of the device in the graveyard, a ghostly murmur from leftover static. Hours passed. The town outside slept to muted street lamps and the sound of distant tires on damp roads. He pressed on, eyes straining in the poor light. When the circuit was complete, he sat back and allowed a quiet satisfaction to settle in his chest. He flicked the switch. The speaker emitted a low hum, fragile and unsteady. He moved his phone closer. The phone's signal disrupted the loop, causing a rhythmic feedback. The LED flickered in response, a tiny pulse of purple. He watched it for a full minute without blinking. The noise rose, wavered, then faded into a barely audible hiss. Every so often there came a pop, a scratch, a squeal that might even have been radio interference. If he closed his eyes and really tried, he could almost imagine a voice. He rubbed the back of his neck. Tension thrummed in tired shoulders. The device still glowed softly, the LED blinking at irregular intervals. He thought about the ghost hunters, how they'd crowd around something like this, searching for the faintest echo of confirmation bias. His phone vibrated with a notification, and the moment broke. He turned the device off. The hum died at once, leaving only the buzz of the overhead light. Sleep did not come easily. In bed, he stared at the ceiling, footsteps from the flat above crossing overhead in slow intervals. Outside, a distant siren moaned through the streets. The vision of those watchers among the tombstones returned, their eyes shining with hope or fear or ignorance. He couldn't decide. He remembered the hush that fell as the device beeped and how the woman's voice trembled with excitement. Did she want to speak to the dead, or only to feel that jolt of the unknown? He found himself intrigued by the power of suggestion, how people could convince themselves. But there was something else too, a sense that he'd made a cynical but smart choice in building the prototype. Maybe he'd sell a few units online. There was a market for this sort of thing, fragile though it might be. He wasn't selling hope, just playing along with their fantasy. His eyes drifted shut. The last image lingering on his mind's eye was the blink of that small LED, pulsing in the darkness. By the next evening, he had polished the design just enough to make it presentable. No fancy casing, just a roughly cut plastic fuse box and heat-shrink tubing to hide the wires. He snapped a few photos with his phone, capturing the LED in mid-flicker, and posted a listing on eBay. EVP detector, ghost hunting device, custom built for serious investigations. He set a modest price, typed up a brief description that explained how sensitive it was, then clicked the button to publish. As he cleared away the spare parts on his table, an uneasy prickle spread through his limbs. He listened for the device's hum, but it was switched off. The flat was silent. No static, no voices, just the hum of electricity behind the walls. He exhaled, shaking off the sensation. There was no reason to feel guilty. If anything, this was a new endeavor, a harmless way to earn a little money from people's fascination with the paranormal. Later that night, as he scrolled through his phone, he saw that the listing had sold already. The buyer had even sent a cheerful note. "Really excited to try this out. I'm in a local group, so if it's good, expect more orders soon." He read the message twice, imagining the device in another person's hands, imagining them crouched in a dark cemetery, holding their breath as the LED blinked and the speaker hissed. He felt a small ripple of satisfaction, tempered by an odd sense of unease he couldn't quite place. Then he switched off the phone and drifted into restless sleep, the faint flicker of that LED still pulsing in his restless thoughts. He didn't expect the orders to pile up so quickly. At first, it was just one or two inquiries through eBay, polite messages asking when he'd have more stock. Then came direct emails, a few people saying they ran paranormal clubs and needed multiple units for group investigations. Some wanted extra LEDs, others asked if he could make them more sensitive, though none of them could define what they meant by that. Within a week, he'd devoted a corner of his living room into a makeshift assembly area. He cleared boxes of old clothes and stacked them against the wall, dragging in a battered folding table to hold the half-finished circuit boards. Components arrived in little padded envelopes almost every day. More condenser microphones, spools of wire, LED strips in varying shades of purple. He set up a workflow, cutting the wires to length in the morning, soldering the main circuit in the afternoon, gluing the housings together at night. He ordered plain plastic enclosures in bulk, cheap boxes with temperamental seals. The finished devices looked a little rough and ready, but nobody seemed to mind. A dash of black spray paint and a printed sticker, and they were custom-made ghost detectors. They sold faster than he could make them. All the while, he told himself it was a harmless business. If people wanted illusions, at least he was giving them something tangible to hold. But a small knot of tension formed in his chest each time he packaged up another unit. He noticed it most after printing the postage labels, when he'd seal the bubble mailer and drop it onto the growing pile by the door. The knot would tighten, just for a second. The strangeness began when he tested several devices together. He liked to ensure they weren't short-circuiting, and that each one produced the same gentle feedback hum. Lining them up in rows on the table, he powered them on in quick succession. Right away, the interference changed. Usually, one device alone made soft static or the occasional squeal if he waved his phone too near. But three or more side-by-side seemed to set off a chain reaction. The hum would swell in waves, sometimes rattling through the tinny speakers like far-off thunder. The LEDs pulsed in irregular patterns, flickers of violet lighting the cramped room. He watched them for a few minutes, fascinated but uneasy. He switched one off, waited, and switched on another. The new device picked up the leftover interference and twisted it into a higher pitch. He pressed a hand to his chest. That knot of tension was back, heavier now. His mind spun with rationalizations, overlapping radio frequencies, slight manufacturing flaws, cheap materials. All of it plausible. But when the lights flickered again in perfect unison, he felt an involuntary shiver crawl up his spine, and he cut the power to all of them. His mood dipped that evening. A tight headache spread from behind his eyes, and old anxieties flickered through his thoughts like pages flipping in a wind. He'd been through bouts of depression before, the heavy kind that made the days blur. This was different, sharper, more immediate, as though something gnawed at him from beneath the surface of normal life. He forced himself to go outside, hoping the cool air would clear his head. Street lamps threw weak circles of orange light onto puddled tarmac. He walked until he found himself at the edges of the graveyard again, though he couldn't remember choosing that route. The iron gate stood open, but he paused on the pavement to stare through the rails instead. A single lamp illuminated the walkway inside, showing rows of tilted headstones and the silhouette of a leafless tree. He felt no urge to enter or even linger. He left quickly, breath visible in the cold, the ache in his skull deepening. By the time he returned to his flat, several more eBay messages were waiting. One buyer sent a friendly note. "We used your gadget last night. It kept lighting up whenever we asked questions. My team loved it. Thanks again." Another review followed a moment later. "I swear I heard voices calling my name on your device. Really satisfied. 5 stars." He read it twice, the tension in his chest flaring. People were excited, hearing things in those bursts of static, shaping them into words that validated their beliefs. It should have felt like a success, yet he felt something closer to dread. Late that night, he tested another batch of 4 units. Their combined chatter rose to a hiss that made him think of insects swarming. The LED pulses strobed across the walls, casting jittery shadows on the pile of boxes in the corner. The headache returned once more, now throbbing in time with each flicker. He couldn't sleep again, so he brewed coffee and stared into the blackness outside his window. Lights in other windows blinked out, one by one. The town sank into its hush, leaving only the distant hum of a passing bus and the whisper of his own uneasy thoughts. He woke the next morning to find fresh feedback posted by a customer. Scary stuff. Had to throw it away. It creeped me out too much. 5 stars, no further explanation. But a private message soon arrived from the same buyer. I don't know what you did to make it so lifelike, but it freaked me out. I swear it was calling to me. Sorry if this sounds insane, but I didn't know who else to tell. He turned away from the screen. The kettle whistled in the corner of the kitchen. He let the water boil a while longer than needed, just to block out the quiet. He thought of those final tests, how the devices seemed to resonate with each other, building layers of noise that set his teeth on edge. He wondered if someone else, alone at night, might experience something stronger than just feedback. At the table, 4 more units stood ready in padded envelopes, addressed and stamped. He could mail them out that morning, keep the money flowing. But the message from that unnerved buyer made him hesitate. He'd counted on these sales to recoup the rent he had spent on components and supplies. Why did a single fearful complaint bother him so much? He lifted one of the envelopes, feeling the weight of the device inside. A flimsy plastic box, a speaker, a few wires, and yet people claimed they heard voices. He thought back to the moment when he'd tested them all at once, how the hum rose to an almost frenetic pitch. It was just interference, random signals bouncing in the building's electromagnetic soup. In the end, he taped the envelopes shut and placed them by the door. The post office opened soon. He told himself the buyer's message was just a curiosity, a strange anecdote from someone prone to overreaction. Still, as he stepped outside into the daylight, he caught himself glancing into every dark reflection in the shop windows, as if he might see something flicker there. And as he did, he recognized the knot in his chest had only grown tighter. Orders kept rolling in, enough to fill half his day just responding to messages. His listing was gaining traction on paranormal forums. Strangers with screen names like Ghostly Gaze and Spectral Detective claimed to have seen incredible results. He shipped units as quickly as he could assemble them, running off shipping labels until the printer squealed in protest. By the end of each day, the floor of his front room was a sprawl of half-packed boxes, clipped wire, and empty takeout containers. He worked there most evenings, the cramped little space that faced the street. No curtains, just a thin blind that filtered the sodium glow of the street lamp outside. The corner was piled with mismatched plastic enclosures and a shoebox of assorted circuit boards. The rest of the room had become a kind of staging ground, with stacked mailers ready for dispatch. When he was hunched over the table, carefully soldering or testing, the outside world drifted away. Occasionally in the periphery, he'd see, or thought he saw, brief flickers of movement. Like a twitch in his vision whenever he looked up. He'd rub his eyes, glance at the ceiling, then tell himself it was the reflection of a passing car, or another headache creeping in. One evening, as he tried to line up 4 new devices for a test, he noticed a shift in the corner of the room, a shape, a shadow, drifting at the edge of the lamp's glow. But by the time he turned, nothing was there. He exhaled, pressed the iron to the last wire, ignoring the tightness in his chest. Too many late nights, he thought. Too few proper meals. His mind was filling in the gaps. He'd grown accustomed to the layered interference the devices created when tested in batches. It was almost routine. Line them up, power them one by one, listen to the rising static. The swirling feedback no longer startled him, and the flickering LEDs, even when they pulsed in near unison, felt almost mundane. He told himself he was simply learning the quirks of cheap components. Yet, on some level, he sensed the tone changing. The feedback grew deeper, more resonant, as though the devices strained to reach frequencies his ears weren't built to handle. Sometimes he'd let them run for 5 or 10 minutes, just to see if they'd settle. They never did. The noise shifted, as if searching for something. He tried to capture the phenomenon on his phone, but the recordings only played back the usual hisses and garbled squeaks. When he listened in real time, though, he swore there were moments that felt alive, almost aware. Still, he told himself it was just an artifact of shoddy components, random signals merging in the electrical noise of the old building. He had no reason to think otherwise. It was past midnight, late in the week, when the first sign of something amiss appeared. The room was dark, aside from a desk lamp and the faint violet glow of 5 newly assembled devices. He'd decided to run them all together, thorough testing, he called it, before shipping the batch the next morning. The loop began the way it always did, a soft hum that rose into a moan of static. The LEDs bobbed and fluttered, throwing pale bursts of color against the walls. He leaned in, adjusting the position of the nearest unit. Often, a slight tilt changed the pitch. The feedback whined, soared an octave, then dipped into a weak, crackling bass. A second device popped, clicked, then rattled into that lower register. Its LED began to blink in an arrhythmic pattern, like a slow strobe. He rubbed his temple. The drone made his head ache. He reached out to switch one off and something whispered. It wasn't the usual hiss or feedback squeal. This was layered, a resonance that felt deeper than the speaker's range. He froze, heart pounding. He couldn't grasp the words if they were even words. It rose and fell smoothly, deliberately. He swallowed and waited for the noise to resolve into familiar static. Instead, the whisper continued, shifting in pitch, the syllables sliding into each other like a moan in slow motion. He strained to catch even a single phrase. A moment passed, maybe seconds, maybe a minute. Then it cut off with a sharp crack. The units droned on, ignorant of his momentary panic. He realized he was holding his breath, shoulders tensed. Slowly, he flicked the main switch, and the hum died across all 5 devices. He had never heard anything quite like that. His hands trembled as he powered back on only the device in question. Silence, then the usual feedback. No layered whisper. He switched on the rest of them, trying to recreate the same exact setup, same angles, same order, hoping to coax that noise back into being. The resulting hum was harsh, metallic, but wholly ordinary. He stared at the devices, heartbeats still thudding in his ears. The silence of the room felt oppressive, like a held breath before a scream. He spent the next half hour wrestling with his old oscilloscope, an ancient relic inherited from a friend at work. He hoped it would capture the waveform, give him a rational explanation for the phenomena. The device glowed green on its dusty screen, lines jumping at intervals to the static's pulse. When he reproduced the test, the interference registered as a chaotic pattern, spikes and dips, random noise that swarmed the display. But nowhere did he see any sign of the smooth, layered speech he'd heard. The waveforms stayed scattered, flickering in tight bursts. He fiddled with the time base, the scale, the trigger level. Each new setting just revealed more random chatter. No sign of that strange whisper. At last, he shut everything off in frustration. The sudden silence rang in his ears, like stepping from a crowded train station into an empty field. He rubbed his temples. The headache that had been threatening him all day finally bloomed in full. He sat down in the nearest chair, letting the darkness settle around him. The street lamp outside cast angled shadows through the window blind, lines of dim orange cutting across the floor. If he stared too long, he could almost see them shift. But he was too drained to look away. Instead, he watched, hollow-eyed, half expecting another flicker of movement on the edge of his vision. The whisper he'd heard replayed in his mind, an echo without meaning. He wondered how many of these devices were already out in the world, buzzing and flickering in living rooms or old church crypts, listened to by believers who might hear something they could never forget. The question left him uneasy, like a door to a dark room he had no interest in entering. He packed up the devices in silence, sealing each one in a bubble-wrap sheath. Too late to change course now. Orders had been paid for, addresses already printed. Yet even as he switched off the lamp, he couldn't shake the sense that the shadows in the corners were biding their time, and that if he dared to linger, he might glimpse them shifting. He paused at the threshold of the room, forcing himself not to glance back. It was just static, he told himself. Just an illusion of sound in the middle of the night. He switched off the overhead light. The hallway was dark. He stood there for a moment, listening, half certain he'd hear that whisper rise again. Only when the silence remained unbroken did he walk away, leaving the room and the whisper behind. He felt it first as a quiet tension behind his eyes, like the onset of a migraine that never quite arrived. Even on good days, there was a persistent tug just under his sternum, warning him that something wasn't right. Yet the orders kept coming, and he forced himself to work, cutting wires, soldering leads, telling the world and himself that everything was fine. The whispers continued, not every day, but often enough that he came to expect them. When they did break through the crackling interference, his nerves spiked in a flash of cold adrenaline. Sometimes he'd let the devices run just to confirm the hush that followed. Other times he'd switch them off almost immediately, hands trembling, unable to listen any longer. Outside his flat, the sky grew darker earlier each evening. Winter was setting in, a damp chill seeping through the thin walls. He left the lights on longer, though sometimes that only made it worse, the glare casting deep shadows that twitched at the edges of his sight. Once, he thought he saw a silhouette in the hallway mirror, a tall shape looming behind him. He spun around, heart hammering, but the hall was empty. He started ignoring messages from friends. A co-worker from the electronics store called to see if he was still alive, joking about how he never showed up for shifts anymore. He texted back a short reply. "I'm working on something at home. Sorry." His mother tried to reach him twice, leaving voicemails about an upcoming family meal. He couldn't face it. He told himself he'd go next week when his head felt clearer, but it never did. He found himself scanning the corners of every room he entered. At first, it was almost subconscious, just a flick of the eyes to check if something lurked in the shadows. But soon, he became aware of doing it almost constantly. At the grocery store, the post office, even the bathroom mirror. It was as though a small part of him believed something might be following, slipping in where it couldn't fully be seen. The devices multiplied in his living room. More orders, more production. Each new batch seemed to carry heavier static, a deeper resonance that rattled in the cheap speakers. Shipping them off should have been a relief. Yet each time he sealed a package, a pang of guilt twisted in his stomach. He was sending these things out into the world, letting unsuspecting people toy with something he no longer fully understood. He tried to rationalize. It's just auditory illusions, electrical interference. I'm overtired and anxious. This is a me problem. But that logic rang hollow, and whenever his phone buzzed with new feedback, he cringed, afraid to read it. Some were glowing endorsements from paranormal enthusiasts, proclaiming, "Amazing, 10 out of 10, while others hinted at darker experiences, the customers unsure if they should be thrilled or terrified. He became convinced there was a physical cause, toxic mold perhaps, or a slow carbon monoxide leak. People online always jumped to that explanation when someone mentioned hallucinations. So he called a technician, paid out of pocket for a rushed inspection. The man arrived on a drizzly afternoon, tested the gas lines and scanned with a CO detector. Nothing. He checked for mold or damp in the walls, mild moisture, but no black fungal blooms. "Looks fine," he said, collecting his fee. The man left and the quiet returned, heavier than before. That evening, a friend banged on the door, calling his name. He froze, standing in the middle of the living room with a half-assembled circuit board in hand. He considered not answering, but the knock came again, more urgent this time. Reluctantly, he opened it. His friend's face clouded with concern. "Haven't seen you in weeks. Are you all right?" She glanced past him at the chaos of parts and shipping boxes. "It smells like burnt plastic in here. What are you up to?" "Just busy," he muttered. "You're pale. When was the last time you slept?" He shrugged, stepping aside to let her in. She took one look at the clutter and the faint flicker of a test device on the table, its LED pulsing, and frowned. "This is insane. You need to get out, see the sun or something." He offered a weak smile. "It's just a job. Filling orders. Staying busy." The lie landed with a dull thud. She tried to press him for answers, but he deflected, claiming he was behind schedule. Eventually, she gave up, backing toward the door with a worried look. "At least call your mum. She's worried," she said, voice soft. And then she was gone, leaving him with the steady drone of a powered-up unit. He switched it off and sank onto the sofa. The silence felt like a scold. A few nights later, he woke with his heart racing. It was 3 in the morning. The overhead light burned, though he couldn't recall leaving it on. He must have dozed off while working. The half-built circuits lay on the coffee table. A spool of copper wire had uncoiled on the floor. His phone blinked with a missed call. He ignored it, standing to stretch out the numbness in his legs. Then he noticed the corner of the room where the table lamp cast a slanted glow. A shape darkened the wallpaper, faint yet distinct. He stared, breath quickening, until he gathered the courage to flick the lamp off. The shape vanished, leaving him alone with the overhead bulb's harsh glare. No sense in scaring himself silly, he thought. But the fear didn't leave. It coiled in his stomach like a snake. Over the next few days, he found reasons not to leave the flat at all. Groceries delivered, supplies ordered online. He told himself he was being productive, but in truth, the outside world felt intangible. His reality revolved around the next device, the next test, the next unsettling flicker in the corner of his vision. One night, he caught sight of a figure near the hallway mirror. No reflection, just a shape lingering where it shouldn't. The fear should have spiked, but instead, something like curiosity took hold. He thought, if I look away, it disappears. If I keep watching, maybe it will resolve itself. He stood there for what felt like hours, gaze locked on the empty hallway. The digital clock on his phone ticked from midnight to 1, then 2. His neck ached, his eyes burned, but he couldn't break his focus. A hush filled the flat, the only sound a faint electrical hum from the living room devices. Eventually, he felt his body sway. He realized he hadn't blinked in minutes. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and when he opened them, the hallway was just a hallway. No figure, no movement. A hollow disappointment settled in his chest, as if he'd missed a critical chance to understand what lurked beyond sight. He had no memory of falling asleep at his desk the next night, but he woke to darkness. The overhead light was off, and the street lamp glow barely reached in through the blind. He rubbed his eyes and checked the time on his phone. 2:47 a.m. His gaze drifted to a corner of the room where the shadows lay thickest. Something moved, slow and deliberate. Not a flicker, not a trick of peripheral vision. It moved, like a limb unfolding, or a body shifting to turn and face him. He should have bolted upright, heart pounding. But he felt no fear at all, only a pull, an almost magnetic tug in his chest. He leaned forward, mesmerized, breath caught in his throat. The shape in the corner seemed to acknowledge his attention, shifting again with a ripple of darkness. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor, but he didn't move to retrieve it. He was transfixed, staring into the gloom, unable or unwilling to break the moment. Something brushed the edge of his mind, a sensation like a whisper without sound. Before he could speak, or scream, or blink, the shape melted back into the dark, leaving the corner empty. His pulse hammered, but it wasn't panic he felt. It was a strange, eager anticipation, like an invitation had just been made. He stayed there for a long while, gaze fixed on that empty corner, waiting for it to return. He rose at dawn with a single purpose. Barely aware of the cold seeping through his windows, he paced the flat, gathering every device he could find. Some sat half-assembled on the coffee table. Others filled a battered cardboard box beneath the desk. There were at least 24 in total, more if he counted the prototypes that never worked quite right. He set them in rows on the living room floor, testing each in turn. A hum here, a flicker there, that familiar swirl of static in the speakers. A few units sputtered and died, cheap circuitry failing. He tossed them aside and moved on with the rest. He told himself that he would confront the phenomenon head-on, prove he was losing his grip on reality, and learn the truth of it. The thought of that truth, whatever it might be, set his pulse skittering. But he pressed on, gathering extension cords, taping down leads, transforming the living room into a makeshift sideshow of cheap plastic boxes and snaking wires. He drew every blind, turned off every lamp until only the faint morning light seeped through in patches. His breath caught in his throat. If he was going to do this, he needed genuine darkness. No more illusions of shifting corners or half-lit shapes. He pinned old bedsheets over the windows and killed the overhead bulb. The flat sank into near total blackness. Then he powered each device in turn. The interference began as a low murmur, a sound beneath hearing, like the rumble of a distant train. It built with each new unit he activated, layering into a churning wave that caused the speakers to rattle. LEDs came to life in a flutter of purple pulses, bathing the floor in strobing pockets of gloom. He sat cross-legged among the tangle of wires, feeling the static brush against his skin like electricity before a storm. A faint, nauseating pressure throbbed at the base of his skull, making him grit his teeth. He told himself it was anxiety, or maybe the old headache returning. As the interference grew louder, the purple LEDs began to sink in a pattern he'd never seen. Bright pulses that seemed to converge, then fade in unison. The entire room flickered with an eerie, rhythmic glow. He swallowed hard. "Come on," he whispered, voice nearly lost in the sea of static. "Show me what you are." A sudden shift carried the pitch upward into a powerful crest. For a moment he thought one of the devices might blow a fuse. Then a wave of near silence washed through the living room, like a sudden collective inhale. In that hush, a new tone emerged, a murmur so low he felt it more than heard it. His chest tightened, as though the air itself were vibrating in slow pulses. The pressure in his skull sharpened, forcing him to close his eyes. When he opened them again, the room had changed. Or rather, it was gone. The floor beneath him was no longer solid, but a shifting, undulating mass. Dark, fibrous, and slick, like wet ash shaped by unseen tides. The last remnants of familiar objects bled away at the edges of his vision, smearing into the vast, depthless void that stretched in every direction. The flickering purple lights were still there, scattered like phosphorescent motes. They stretched outward, forming an impossible expanse of shimmering spots, flaring and dimming like something trying to breathe. He looked down, or tried to. His body wasn't quite there. He felt his limbs in some abstract sense, but they seemed weightless, insubstantial. The space around him thrummed with a presence he couldn't name. Then far above, or below, or everywhere, something moved. It defied perspective, a shape so vast it swallowed the distance. For a heartbeat, he couldn't comprehend its scale. Then it resolved into a churning mass of darkness, threaded with veins of pale, golden luminescence. As he stared, threads of that luminescent tissue parted, and a multitude of eyes opened. They were larger than city blocks, or smaller than atoms. He couldn't tell. They blinked in silent unison, countless black orbs with pinprick pupils that focused on him. His mind rebelled. He tried to shift his gaze, but there was nowhere else to look. This entity filled everything, up, down, and sideways. It gazed without blinking, uncountable eyes locked onto the tiny speck of consciousness he occupied. A soundless pressure built in his ears, like the air before an explosion. He felt his thoughts vibrate, as if the entity's awareness pressed into him. The weight of it was suffocating. Somehow it shifted. The colossal shape bent or twisted, acknowledging him. He sensed its curiosity, the faintest ripple of intention. A new wave of pressure crashed through his skull, a vibration too deep to be a noise. He couldn't have described it if he tried. It was like a message burned directly onto his brain, a dark communication beyond language. He felt it in every nerve, an icy dread spiked through with awe. He wanted to scream, but there was no air, no mouth, just himself, floating in a vacuum of unimaginable depth, pinned under the gaze of an entity that shouldn't exist. Suddenly it spoke, or perhaps revealed itself. A billion voices in screaming silence, an impossible statement of intent. His mind wrenched sideways, filled with too many ideas, too many truths. Then, abruptly, he was back. The living room returned in a rush of sensory overload. Cables, plastic enclosures, the smell of solder and stale coffee. The devices screeched with layered feedback, and the purple LEDs blinked so rapidly it looked like stuttering lightning. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping. Cold sweat drenched him. His heart slammed against his ribs. He tried to push himself up, but his arms wouldn't obey. The world wavered, the black corners of the room stretching in elongated arcs, as though the geometry around him was still wrong. His throat felt raw, though he had no memory of screaming. He blinked, tears streaming down his cheeks, and the afterimage of those countless eyes shuddered across his vision. The devices continued to shriek. Each LED pulsed in perfect unison now, a rapid staccato that tore at his senses. He wanted to turn them off, to rip out the wires, but his limbs were leaden. He couldn't even lift a hand to shield his face. He lay there, half on his side, staring at the swirling purple lights. Fresh waves of fear lanced through him whenever he closed his eyes, because he saw the eyes waiting, pressing their presence into his skull. A strangled moan built in his throat. He tried to speak, to call for help, but his jaw wouldn't move. His lips felt cold, numb. He tried to kick out or even roll over, but his muscles refused. Paralysis held him fast. Hot tears spilled over his cheeks, and his vision swam. He had thought he wanted the truth, that he could handle whatever lay beneath the static and flickers. But confronted by that endless void, such incomprehensible scale, he realized how naive he'd been. The devices screamed on. Purple lights strobed. The carpet blurred beneath him. His breath stuttered, and for a moment he thought he might black out. But consciousness dragged him along, forcing him to endure the horror. He felt every second stretch into an eternity, pinned under the weight of what he had seen. His mind reeled, trying to claw back any semblance of normalcy, but it was too late. The static screech rose in a final crescendo, the purple LEDs flashing so fast it nearly blinded him. Then, in a blink, all the devices cut out at once. The room plunged into pure, ringing darkness. He stared up, paralyzed, eyes still streaming. No hum, no flickers, just the echo of that terrible, endless presence, blazing behind his gaze like an aftershock. And he could do nothing but lie there, helpless, heart still hammering, mind still filled with the memory of those countless black eyes.